in terms of the results that you're seeing, it's obviously really powerful. There's a common phrase in psychedelic circles of set and setting. And when it comes to these ketamine clinics, they've actually been around in some form or another for about a decade. But what Mindbloom is doing, and there's a very small handful of newer companies that are coming to market that are offering clinics and patient services, and there's just a different experience. Can you talk a little bit about that contrast, or I guess how you think about the Mindbloom experience versus your run-of-the-mill ketamine clinic that you might happen upon that's been around for 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Mindbloom, we think about two core focuses. So it all stems from our mission to transform lives today, to transform the world tomorrow, because maybe like you, we really believe ardently that if we're successful, we're going to accelerate the healthcare system's adoption of psychedelic therapies, make a dent in global human suffering, and potentially even like elevate humanity's collective wisdom, compassion, and consciousness. So the way that we're approaching that is twofold. One is to increase access, and the second is to just deliver exceptional, clinically efficacious and transformative experiences. The way that we're increasing access is we're really focused on how to make treatment more approachable, more affordable, and more available to people. And one of the biggest levers that we have for that is leveraging technology. One of the ways that the Mindbloom experience differs from, I think, a lot of other experiences is that it's completely virtual and online. So we leverage a network of partner clinicians that we're supporting who are psychiatric clinicians prescribing ketamine therapy for people who have diagnosable conditions of anxiety and depression today. And then we support those clinicians and those clients with a network of coaches who are psychedelic guides who are helping support the clinicians and the patients throughout the experience. And it's all taking place on an application similar like Calm or Headspace for psychedelic therapy. What that allows us to do is to, one, I think, make treatment a little more approachable for people who are, wary or apprehensive or even scared of these new treatments by creating a really clean, polished, seamless journey and in a way where they're supported from end to end by one of these guides who is their peer and by a psychiatric expert who also understands these medicines intimately. Two, we've dropped the price down from your average ketamine clinic about 80%. So Mindbloom is between $150 and $250 per session, whereas a lot of ketamine clinics today can be between $600 and $1,200 a session, depending on where the provider of the treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And then third, ketamine clinics are naturally geographically constrained. So I think a lot about how do we get treatment to a single mother who's been depressed for 30 years, who's like a 3.5-hour drive outside of Kansas City, Missouri. And by using a telemedicine-based approach, we're able to rapidly increase availability to a lot of people who otherwise might not have access to that, especially depending on when your listeners listen to this, but I don't know how optimistic people are, but especially like in these times of COVID where people are particularly constrained in their ability to travel. So I think that's a big part of how the approach is different in terms of increasing access. And other than that, we're a extremely well-capitalized venture-backed tech startup backed by some of the top investors and have a team of people who are both completely mission obsessed with psychedelic therapy, but are also like professionals at what they do and have really dug in to build an incredibly exceptional client experience from end to end that focuses both on like the mindset, like you pointed out, and helping them craft the perfect physical setting while connecting with experts in the field to support them through the journey, which is, as an end result, is creating these really like outsized clinical outcomes compared to both traditional ketamine clinics and traditional antidepressants, as well as just exceptional client experiences that leave people uplifted and in a place where they can actually create some strong behavioral changes throughout treatment.
So I know that this year in 2020, there were some accelerations of the telemedicine laws that allowed you to open up your services to a number of different states in the US. I believe it's a state-by-state issue. Can you talk a little bit about what those changes were this year and what you're expecting over the next year or two?
Yeah, absolutely. So There are a variety of different regulations at the federal and state level around the prescribing of controlled substances. One is the Ryan-Haight Act, which is a federal act that prohibits the prescribing of controlled substances online. It really came about in the 90s, whereas the internet became ubiquitous. There were some, shady shops that were slinging pain pills on the internet, which not a huge externality and problem, but potentially in a little too sweeping bureaucratic fashion, we passed a statute that outlawed the prescribing of all controlled substances. About 20 years later here, or it was 2009 was when they passed this. So 11 years later, telemedicine has dramatically advanced and improved, and not allowing people to access medicine remotely is a huge impediment to patient access, especially now. The federal government and state governments are following suit, have enacted some pretty critical and overdue changes to begin allowing the prescribing of controlled substances through telemedicine. And so the landscape has continued to shift both in the short and long term. And that was something we were a little bit ahead of.